Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well. And I really mean it. You know, I always mean it, but I now really mean it. We're going through some stuff all across the world, and I really hope all of you are doing well. Some of you may have seen on Twitter that our daughter is quite sick. We don't know for sure if it is COVID-19. Doctors think it might be, but unfortunately there are not enough tests going around to actually, get her tested. They are reserved at the moment for those who are at high risk, the elderly, those with underlying health conditions. So, it's tough times, but I really hope all of you are doing well. Please let me know in the comments how you're doing. And, we're all in this together. And what I wanted to do today, because a lot of people are at home, thank you, Jack, for sending me all the boops, and I will, welcome everyone in a second. But what I want to do today, since people are at home, some people are unfortunately out of work, I wanted to kind of go back to the basics. Usually I use these Adobe XD Masterclasses to go a little bit deeper than what we do. Andrea Hawk just did an amazing XD Daily Challenge. And usually I would kind of bounce off of that and go a little bit deeper, but I want to go back to the basics today because I know a lot of people are going to be watching this who might be looking for a change. They might be looking to do something while they're out of work. And, Adobe XD, you can download it for free. You can start designing. So that's what we're going to be doing today. But before I dive in, I want to say a big hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening to Kara and Ryan and Lena and Cindy and Jack and Eva and Akin and Anna and Liu and Tim, great moderator. Thank you, Tim, for doing everything that you've been doing. Also, Tim was live with Val not too long ago. That was super cool. I think that was our first live stream that spanned across two completely different continents. So, obviously the virus thing it's rough, but we're finding ways to adapt to it, and that's a perfect example. Val and Tim were streaming at the same time. Technology is great. I think it's super cool. Hey, Abdullah, welcome everyone, and Juan and Eric, you're welcome for doing this. This is what I'm here for. All right. And thank you everyone for the kind wishes. Hopefully we can get that confirmed sooner rather than later, but thankfully kids are pretty resistant to this stuff. Not completely resistant, but they get through it. So, it might get passed on to me if she does have it. I'm fairly healthy, but I know my thoughts go out to everyone, especially in Italy and many of the European countries who are getting hit pretty hard. It's rough, and my thoughts go out to everyone who's at high risk. So be safe, wash your hands. If you're told to stay at home, please stay at home. Even if you're not told to stay at home, right? We're all in this together. We'll get through it. We will. All right, so let's go ahead and hop over to my screen. And again, if anyone has questions throughout this stream, I'm here. Let me know, and I will also be streaming for 2 hours on Monday and 2 hours on Tuesday, so if you have more questions, just wait till then and throw them at me, but you can also ask them here. So if you're brand new to Adobe XD, you can head over to letsxd.com. I've got a ton of videos on there, and I also have Danny Beaumont's videos. If you're just getting started, you can hop in there. She has a great series for the very beginner users, and I also have a ton of videos. A brand new video came out this week on creating these fun little page indicators. Maybe I'll touch on that on Monday and Tuesday as well. Thank you, Tim, for posting that in the chat. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? Well, I post a little hint on Twitter, but I'm going to be designing a music application, and again, we're going to be starting from the very basics. So if you're brand new to XD, or even if you've been using it for a while, you might pick up on some tips and tricks. So when you launch XD, this is kind of what you're going to see. You're going to see a pretty standard splash screen, some tips at the top, and some of this might link to my content, which is always fun, right? And down here, you can start with a brand new artboard or design, kind of get going really quickly. So we're going to start with, let's go big. We're going to start with an iPhone XR or 10R, whatever the numbers mean and letters mean, 10S Max or 11 artboard. Of course, if you do want to design for Android, you can totally do that. If you want to design for iPad or web. One cool thing, before I dive into things, if you saw the announcement that Apple released, iOS or iPad OS 13.4, I believe, now supports mouse and trackpad support, and that means hover effects. You can finally put hover effects on mobile. the bridge, the gap between the iOS, or I guess iPad OS, and the desktop is kind of squishing inwards a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and go into an iPhone, the biggest iPhone we can possibly design for, and this is what you're going to see. You're going to see a lovely artboard smack in the center. You're going to see your tools on the left. You're going to see your assets, and then down here at the bottom, you can switch between your assets panel, your layers, and your plugins, and we might dive into some plugins today. I already have some great plugins installed, which we might touch on, and we're going to just get going. So I want to start by Tim, of course you had to bring up dark mode, right? Everyone is always bringing up dark mode. Maybe one day we'll have, did you see Facebook now has dark mode? That's kind of fancy. Maybe one day XD will have dark mode, but the team is working on some amazing things. I've been playing with some stuff that's coming out in the maybe not too distant future. We'll see how things go. But the team is working on some good stuff. All right, that's all I'm gonna give you. Nothing else. Follow Andrew Shorten on Twitter. He posts some good sneaks. So, here we go. I want to start very basic. We're going to just start laying things out and just kind of blocking things in. And on Monday and Tuesday, I'm going to be diving deeper into like the wireframing process and just kind of blocking things in and then going from there. But since we only have an hour today, let's start. And I want to start by actually adding some color to this artboard. So I have the entire artboard selected. And over here to the right, we have our appearance section within the properties inspector. And this entire pane over here to the right is called the properties inspector, and that applies to design and prototype mode. Hey Eric, and hey Andre, welcome everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the fill next to appearance, and let's go ahead and let's go not that color. Let's go nice and vibrant today. We're going to go for a nice pink. And usually something like this, it's really in your face, right? Eric is asking, any chance of your XD project being ported to Xcode as a full build? It's maybe I'll talk more about that on Monday and Tuesday when we have a longer stream. But the gist of it is the team is working on a lot of really cool things to bridge that gap between engineers and designers. But it's very tricky to take design and export it directly to code, to working code. But they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes that I think you might be happy with. All right, so we've got our artboard looking very pink, very red, whatever color you want to call this, but I don't want the whole entire screen to be this bright, vibrant color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my rectangle over here to the left, and every time I grab the rectangle, I think of Ryan, who I think is in the chat. I think I saw him in there. I mean, that's design, right? A lot of rectangles, a lot of circles. Hey, Richard, welcome. So I'm gonna just drag a rectangle across this entire artboard. Maybe I'll just move it down a little bit. And to give this artboard a little bit of style, just so it's not too blocky, I might want to round out the corners a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to just grab these little handles, and on rectangles and on polygons, you've got these little handles on the inside of the shape. There's Ryan. And I'm just gonna pull these in a little bit. And I can see the values over here in the properties inspector over to the right. I can also adjust them manually if I wanted to. So if I wanted to, let's say, just have 32 pixels, something like that, I can just enter that there. I can also enter them on an individual basis. What I can also do is, since I want the top corners to be rounded, I may not necessarily want the bottom corners to be rounded as well. So I can hold down my Alt or Option key and just drag these handles back inwards, just like that. And you're noticing they also update within the properties inspector. I'm also going to turn off the border because, the separation between the white container and the pink background works pretty well. All right, so next thing we want to do is we want to start blocking some additional elements that might go above this container and also inside of this container. We're going to be using one of my favorite features in just a few moments is repeat grids. Many of you may know what a repeat grid is, many of you may not know. But before we get to that, I might want to block out a bit of a search bar. Now, to make sure all of my elements line up really nicely and I have a nice amount of padding on the sides of my artboard, I may want to drag out some guides. So over to the left-hand side of an artboard and over to the top, you can see if you just hover, there's this invisible area that kind of appears as you hover over top of it. And as you drag out a guide, there's contextual information. So it's letting me know that right now it is 32 pixels from the left side of the screen, and it's also 382 pixels from the right side of the screen. So all of this contextual information will help you plan out your guides quite nicely. I'm also going to drag one out on this side. Again, 32 pixels. I probably don't need one towards the top, but because we are designing for a modern day iPhone, you have to keep in mind that there is a notch up there. So it's somewhere about here. So maybe I'll just pop a guide right about here. We do have iOS templates that you can download. If you go to File and then Get UI Kits, you can download templates for Apple iOS, Material Design, Microsoft Windows, and so on and so forth. So if you want to make sure that you really pay attention to where that notch is at the top, then you can overlay, a part of one of the elements that's inside of that kit. But I'm gonna kind of eyeball it. It's probably somewhere right about there. But hey, Christoph, Total XD noob here. Well, you're in the right place. Welcome, Christoph. And Christoph and anyone else, if you do have questions, throw them in the chat and I will be happy to answer them. Unless it's about dark mode, probably won't answer that. All right, so we've got the guides kind of set up, everything's looking good, and now when I grab, let's say, a rectangle, and I just draw one out, everything snaps really nicely. So I'll just drag one out just like this, and this I might want to use for a search field. So I'm simply going to round out the corners to kind of match the aesthetic of the rest of the design, and then maybe over to the right, I might want like a profile icon. And you're noticing, if you look really closely, there's smart guides. In addition to the guides that we dragged out, there are smart guides that help us let us know that, once we start creating this element, it's going to line up with the element over to the left, which is really nice. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key to drag this out, and again, everything snaps into place. Beautiful. And I'm going to just make some adjustments just like that. All right, and we're starting off fairly basic. So, I'm not going to fill in these things right away, but we may get back to them at some point in the future. But one thing I might want to do is add a profile picture. So I'm going to hop over to Finder, and I'm going to go into one of my folders over here. I've got some great headshots, very colorful headshots, and all I have to do is just grab one of them. I always love using this guy with his magical beard. I can't grow a magical beard, so, I look to this guy that I grabbed from Adobe stock, and he's my spirit animal. I'm gonna simply just drag this into XD, and what you're gonna notice is that any shape that I drag onto can be used as a mask, and when I pop it into place, boop, there we go. It just masks it really nicely. And if I needed to, I can double click, I can enlarge it to really focus on that majestic beard, just like that. And when I click out of it, it remasks it, which is super fun. All right. Now, the next thing we might want to do is, down in this container, there might be a few things we might want to add. Maybe a section at the top for stories. Every application has stories these days. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter is apparently getting stories. Maybe Adobe XD should have stories. Should XD have stories? Okay, maybe not. But maybe right over here we might want some stories. And then we might want some maybe featured albums or featured playlists, and then we might want a larger section at the bottom for recommended songs or playlists. And then of course we might want a music player at the bottom so we can control our songs. So Eric is saying it would be amazing if XD went from design to app. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, that's totally something the team is thinking about, exploring, and they're working on a bunch of features to kind of bridge that gap between designers and developers. It's a very tricky problem to solve, but definitely something that's on their mind. So, stay tuned. We got some stuff coming. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on the stories section. So I'm going to drag out a circle just about here. And again, I'm holding down my Shift key to constrain it to a perfect circle. And it did snap really nicely to my guide on the side. I'm also going to switch over to my layers panel, which is right down here, and just to make sure that some of this stuff is nicely named. So I'm going to name this search. I might want to name this profile, and maybe the background container I'm just going to name container. Simple, right? So we've got this circle here. I'm going to change the color just for now, just so I can see it against the white background. And there are a few ways we can get images into this specific circle, but there might also be a few other things we might want to do first. So if you're familiar with stories on Facebook or Instagram, any of those platforms, they typically have a border surrounding that profile picture at the top. So to let you know if a person, whoever you're following, has uploaded a new story. So what we're going to do, we have one circle in place. This might be the border. I'm going to go ahead and change the fill to a linear gradient. And we'll go for a nice color. We'll kind of bring in some of that purple and pink that we're using at the top. and then maybe we'll go to a little bit of a more bluer color, kind of like that. Now we don't have to worry too much about this looking overpowered because we are going to be, there you go, Tim. I don't know what that's going to link to. I don't know what, that might be the one that is that the one that I'm using, Tim? It's not. I'm gonna have to check that out later. So what we're going to do now is, because we have the border in place, we're gonna duplicate it. And I can do that by holding down Command and pressing D on the keyboard and just moving this inwards a little bit. I'm gonna change the color just so I can see what I'm working with. And I'm just going to move it in. And now we have the border, and we also have an ellipse in the center that we can use for the actual image. Now the big question is, how do we get additional ones across our artboard? If you've never used XD before, what you might be compelled to do is grab both of them, duplicate, duplicate, duplicate. It's a very manual process. Nobody wants to deal with that, right? So I have both of these layers selected in my layers panel, and over here to the right we have one of the most magical icons in all of applications, Repeat Grid. And when you press it, you are required to say boop, otherwise the repeat grid doesn't work, right? It's true, it's very true. And when you do that, you have two handles that appear around your elements. You have one over to the right and one at the bottom. And essentially what this will allow you to do is pull out additional whatever it is inside, right? So in that case, I have the two circles, and now I can pull out one, I can pull out two, I can pull out 3, 4, and so on and so forth. I can just keep going as many as I possibly want. I can also pull them down if I wanted to, but in a situation like this for stories, this probably wouldn't work. You can also adjust the padding just like this. And if you did have additional ones going down, you can also adjust the padding going down as well. But we're gonna leave it right about here. Beautiful. All right, so now that we have some additional, elements going across our artboard, how do we actually add some content? Well, you remember a few minutes ago, I did add an image just by dragging it directly into that mask, and we can do the exact same thing for our story. So I'm gonna hop over to Finder one more time. Got some more great images, and I might wanna grab, let's say, this image here, and this one, and this one. How many do I have? 4, possibly? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, I can't count. This one, and we'll just grab this one as well. So we've got 5 images selected. Instead of dragging one at a time into Adobe XD, you simply have to drag the whole stack and boop, it magically filled in the entire thing. And of course, if you did want to replace one specific image, you can just grab one image and drag it in there individually, but this looks pretty good. And just like we could earlier with the mask, we can double click, move this over a touch, and everything looks great. I can double click on this one, scale it up so she fills in that circle really nicely, and look at that, everything looks pretty good. Now, one of the questions you might have is, what if I wanted maybe this story over here and this one over here to kind of be grayed out? So maybe you've already looked at that story. You might be familiar with this experience on Instagram. Once you watch a story, the border kind of goes away, it kind of dims out. Now, your instinct might be to double click into this, grab the fill, and maybe just, reduce the opacity. But you might be noticing something's happening. It's kind of applying it across all of the entries, all of the cells in this repeat grid. That's definitely not what you want, right? And that's by design. When you update a repeat grid, so let's say, for example, I move things around or I make this bigger or smaller, if it's not text-based, you're overriding text, then those style changes apply to everything. So one thing we can do, and we're gonna get more into components a little bit later on, but we can grab this border shape, this one right here, and turn this into a component. And I'm gonna show you why that's so important in a second. So over here to the right, you can press the plus button beside component. You can also go into your assets panel and press the plus button here. I'm going to dive more into assets a little bit later today, also on Monday and Tuesday. So that's colors, but here's components right here. And while I'm here, I can also add that color, if I wanted to my assets panel. And what that'll allow me to do is that'll allow me to change just once, and you're going to notice it's updating everywhere, which is super cool. So now that this is a component, right, over here, and Christoph is saying, what a warm welcome. I do have a question. I'm in charge of only visuals of an app, and I just send the file. Since I'm now working in Photoshop, I now would it be better if I created it in XD? So ultimately you have to use whatever application you're most familiar with and comfortable with. But what's really cool about XD, and come back on Monday and Tuesday when I have the longer streams, is that you can mark assets for export. So if I go into my layers panel, I should have probably named that component. I'm going to name this story. So in my layers panel, you can mark a layer for export. You can also do that inside of your properties inspector. That way you can share your developer specs with your clients or your coworkers or whoever they might be. Then they can download just the elements that they need: colors, character styles, marked assets. And again, I'm going to get into that Monday and Tuesday, but there's a lot of cool stuff that Adobe XD does to help with the sharing process. And we're working on even more, so it's going to be fun. So now that I've converted this into a component, what this will allow me to do, again, if I wanted to kind of gray out these ones, if I double click into this component, I can now drop this down to, let's say, 10%. I can do the same thing for this one. I can press the 1 key on my keyboard, it drops it down to 10%. So because we have a component inside of Repeat Grid, it allows you to dive in there and override specific elements, which is super cool. Now, I wouldn't recommend converting the actual images, these ones here, into components, because that will block you from dragging in images in bulk and kind of distributing them across the Repeat Grid. So, little tip here and there. I will get more into components a little bit later. So we've got our stories at the top. I'm going to name this stories. Now down below over here, let me turn my guides back on. We may want some additional repeat grids. And for that, I'm going to grab my rectangle and I might want to drag one out. So here's about the halfway mark of our artboard, and the smart guide is letting me know that that is halfway. I may want to drag one out a little bit more than half. Something like this, not a perfect square, but somewhere around there. And just to kind of keep consistency, I'm going to drag in the corners just a little bit. Let's say around 8 pixels looks pretty nice. There we go, just so I can see it again against the background. And just like I did before, I'm going to press the repeat grid button and drag one additional card across the artboard. Now I'm purposely leaving it kind of hanging off the artboard. That way we can explore drag triggers. We can kind of also just give users and testers the impression that, you know, you can swipe over to see additional cards. And you can also adjust the padding just like I did before. Let's go for 8 pixels, that looks pretty nice. And I'm gonna hop over to Finder, and I'm going to, let's grab some images. I've got some great images, music-based images here. That one looks pretty good. And let's go for, what else looks good? I mean, they all look pretty good. I'm gonna grab that one. Boop, there we go. Drag them into the repeat grid. And all of a sudden, things are looking pretty good in this application. Now let's do one more. So for this one, I'm gonna grab my rectangle one more time, and I'm going to draw one out. So there's my halfway mark. I might want this square. So there's halfway. I'm gonna go back a little bit, just like that. Roll round at the corners, just like we have been doing. There we go. Now for these ones down here, these might be, Eric saying, is there an XD Discord? Oh, there we go. Tim just popped it in there. Tim is always on it. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, there's about 30 some odd thousand people in that Discord. It's a fantastic resource for all of you. So we've got our square, right? Now underneath, we might want some additional information about these specific albums or playlists or whatever these might be. And this is gonna lead up to something really cool, still within the repeat grid realm. And what I should do probably is just rename this feature. All right, so right down here, I'm gonna grab my text tool, and I'm going to, and someone's asking, does XD support animation within artboard, especially when you're scrolling on a long artboard? So yes and no. We do have anchor links now, so you can go from the top of an artboard down to the bottom, and I have a video on that on letsxd.com. We also support component-based animation, which looks like we probably will have time to get to, so stick around. I'm also going to dive into it Monday and Tuesday. So I've got my text tool selected. I'm going to simply click, and this might be song name, right? Just like that. And now I can start styling this text. So I might, I can pull this up, pull this down. It's a little bit large. It's about 16, it's not too bad, but maybe I'll just drop it just a little bit. I can also, of course, style within my properties inspector over to the right. Now for the typeface, I know a lot of people, whoops, that's not the one I wanted. A lot of people grind on me for using Poppins so much. Poppins is a fun font. I've been using it once in a while. Sophia Pro is also a good one, but let's go for Poppins just because, right? Poppins is fun. And for this one, I might want to go for like a semi-bold font and maybe drop the color just a little bit, something like that. Song name, and then maybe down below I can duplicate this, holding down Alt or Option, and then dragging down. And this might be artist name. And this is going to be secondary, so I can go ahead and drop this to maybe, let's go for regular. Maybe I'll drop the size a little bit. And as I'm doing this, you know, it's very easy to get caught up in your styling when you're zoomed quite in. So what you can do is over up to the top, you can press the play button. And this will kind of give you a better overview of how things are looking. And maybe on Monday and Tuesday, I'll show you how you can actually connect your devices, like your iPhones, your iPads, your Android devices, to your computer so you can preview it in real time as well. So I'm looking at that, might want to move this down a little bit. Let's say 8 pixels. I can also leave this up as well. I can put this on my second monitor so that as I'm designing, it updates in real time, but that's looking pretty good. And I might want to just drop the opacity of this just a touch, maybe, you know, 75% or 70%, something like that. All right. So Richard's saying, last day of school for now, lots of time to design. Indeed. Yeah, we're going to be all doing a lot of designing over the next few weeks. Hopefully doesn't extend much longer than that, but, you know, let's all play it safe. So we've got our elements looking pretty good. We've got our rectangle that we're going to be using for our albums. We also have a song name and an artist name. And just like we have been doing before, we want to put all this stuff into a repeat grid. So I'm going to select all 3 of these elements. I'm holding down my Shift key and clicking on all the other ones. And I'm going to, once again, press the repeat grid button at the top. Just like that. I can drag one out this way. Oh, that almost lined up perfectly. Look at that. Fancy. But it didn't line up perfectly. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to just change the padding just a little bit, just like that. Beautiful. And I might want to drag a few extra down the artboard. Now, you might be asking, well, I can't really see any going down the artboard because it kind of cuts off. And we're going to get into how to enable scrolling in just a second. But we now have some additional albums or songs or playlists, whatever, extending down the artboard. And we need some content. So once again, I'm going to hop over to Finder. And I've got some, let's go ahead in here, recommendations. I've got some images. I'm going to grab these images. I think there's 6 of them here. Pop them directly into the repeat grid. But we also have these text layers that we need to deal with. Now, of course, one thing we can do is we can just dive in here and double click and let's say upside down, right? Whatever it might be, right? You can just do that. That's a very manual process. So let me show you one more thing in terms of repeat grids that I absolutely love. Back in Finder, you may have noticed that right here, I've got 2 text files. One with a few albums and one with a few artists. And all I need to do, just like I did with the images, is just drag this directly in here and boop, look at that. Just drag this in here, boop, look at that. Isn't that fancy? And it just grabs, basically it's a plain text document, and it just goes line by line, and it just, you know, fills them in to all of the text layers, which is really cool. And of course, I can, if I needed to, I can always go in, make some changes and override that stuff, but everything's looking pretty good. All right, how are things looking? So we've got our featured section at the top. We've got our soothing chords. We've got our recommendations down here. We may want to add some additional text layers to kind of let our users know what each section is. Now, of course, at the top, the story section, hopefully at this point is pretty self-explanatory, but maybe here we might want to put some text as well. So I'm going to move some of this stuff down, and Tim is saying you have to replace the sound with boop. I think I agree, Tim. Featured playlists, just like that. I might want to set this to semi-bold and maybe just make it a little bit larger. Maybe 16 pixels, that looks pretty good. Pop it right about there, move this down, duplicate it, and recommendations, just like that. And all of a sudden we're adding some context on our repeat grids and our, you know, design in general. I can move this around, move it into place. I can also group things if I needed to make sure that everything's looking good. If I press play, it's looking okay. I would probably make a few small tweaks here and there, but I do want to move on so that we can cover a lot more fun stuff. So for now, we're going to leave this in place. Now, the next thing we might want to do for this specific artboard is add a player at the bottom. So you can actually see what song is playing. You can go to the next song, previous song, start, stop, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my rectangle one more time, draw one out. Now, again, because we're designing for a modern iPhone, there are design elements we have to think about. And on this iPhone in particular, there is a little bit of a home indicator down at the bottom. It's approximately here, and it's approximately that large, right? So, and you have to keep in mind that you can't really have any elements that are going to be interacted with underneath that home indicator. So keep that in mind. You can always draw one out or grab a template if you wanted to. But for now, I'm just kind of eyeball things. Now I might want the rounded corners again on this, so maybe I'll just drag them out. Let's say 24 pixels, looks pretty good, nice. Pull these ones back, just like that. Now, the big question is, how do we style this, right? We've got this container at the bottom. I'm gonna just change the color just for a second. There's a lot of different ways we can style this. We could, of course, grab this color up here. So we can grab our eyedropper, or you can use the shortcut key I and just click on that color. And we've got this nice pink bar at the bottom. It looks okay. The big question is it too much pink? It might be, it might not be. One thing that I kind of like to do, if I want to get fancy, is add background blurs. So what I'm going to do is over here to the right, I'm going to turn on background blur. And what that's going to do, it's going to start introducing magic into our design. And I can, you gotta be careful with background blurs, especially if you're going to have elements. Let me actually turn the background blur off. Before we do that, let me start adding some elements on top of this, and then we're going to talk about background blurs and shadows. And Tim is saying colorful drop shadow, perhaps, possibly. Those are tricky, but I do introduce those from time to time. So what I might want to do is, since I already have some of these elements already in place, for example, if I hide this, if I dive in here, I might want to highlight this particular album or this one on my player, right? Let's go ahead and grab this one. So I'm going to just simply dive into the repeat grid. I'm going to select this element, select this one, and this one again, holding down Shift. I'm going to copy it to my clipboard. I'm going to go ahead and unhide my player at the bottom, which I'm going to name Music Player. I also have to make sure to keep everything up to date in terms of naming. There we go. And I'm simply going to paste. And now I have these elements that I can just use for this section. So I'm going to just start rearranging some things, make this a little bit smaller. And because this is a rectangle, I can just round out the corners completely if I wanted to. I can make them a little bit more round, quite a bit more round. But let's go ahead and pull this inwards. Pop it right about there. Grab this text, move it over. Now you can kind of start to see the problems and the challenges that are arising as I'm designing this with the pink background. Pink is very difficult because it limits you to what you can do. Of course, I can change this to white, but if you have an image here that has a pink as the background, you might have to, add a border, for example, which we're going to do anyway, but you have to kind of keep that in mind. So maybe instead, we might want to go back to that background blur. So I went ahead and selected the background, and over here in the Properties Inspector, I'm going to press Background Blur. Now, more challenges have arisen. And again, this is kind of what you have to think about as you're adding background blurs and shadows. They are sometimes very tricky. If you were to add a background blur with very little blur, things start to really blend in, which you probably want to avoid. So if you're going to do a background blur in a situation like this, you'll probably want to grab the amount slider and drag it all the way to the right to blur things quite a bit. And you're already starting to see the legibility went from, well, I can't read anything, to, okay, well, I can kind of read something. It's still not great though. So of course you can go ahead and adjust your brightness. So you can go very bright if you wanted a nice light style. You can also go pretty dark if you wanted a dark style. You can also start to introduce some of the color of the original layer if you wanted to. So I did have the pink selected, and if I bring up the transparency, it starts to bring in a little bit of that pink, which is nice. And if I introduced, let's say, black, it brings in a little bit of the black. So you can really start to play with and fine-tune your background blurs to get exactly the look that you're after. Now, of course, now that I have a dark background blur and a dark music player, the dark text obviously isn't going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and select those and just bump that up to white. And all of a sudden, things start to become much more legible. Richard, dark mode. No dark mode. So we've got that done. And of course, you can play around with your background blurs and your colors. If you want to go really light, you can do that. And of course, you would probably have to change the text to a little bit darker. But for now, I am going to stick with a darker background blur because I think that looks pretty good. And hey, everyone who's just joining, I saw Daniela and we've got Ashi. Welcome, everyone. So we've got that going on. One other thing we might want to add is because we're working with a pretty confined space, there's a few ways to introduce a play scrubble. Scrubble? I don't know what that is. A scrubber. We could go ahead and grab a line and just kind of drag one across like this, but then we're kind of wasting space. So what I'm going to do instead is kind of work with this album artwork. So I'm going to duplicate it, Command and Control D. I'm going to name this scrubber, and I might want to turn on the border. I'm going to turn the border to white, and I might want to set it on the center of our shape, just like that. Let's increase the size a little bit. I can turn off the fill, just like that. Now, one thing we can also do is play around with our dashes and our gaps. So if I start increasing the dash and maybe increasing or decreasing the gap, you can really start to fine tune these things just like that. And all of a sudden, we've got this kind of fun scrubber that will show us the progress of this music player, just like this. And I can rotate it if I wanted to. And then maybe at the end to kind of show us where we are in the song, I can grab the ellipse tool, draw one out, turn off the border, and we're saving a lot of space. So we don't have this big scrubber at the top of our music player. It's kind of all contained within this section here. And I can just go ahead and just group these, call this scrubber, and there we go. So our music player at the bottom is coming along, but we might want to add a few additional elements. We might want a back button, a forward button, a pause button, for example. So I'm going to dive in here. We're going to make this very simple. We're going to start with a play button or a pause button. I'm going to grab my ellipse, draw one out like that. I might want to turn off the fill, introduce a white border like that. Nothing too crazy, right? And then on the inside, we might want 2 lines for the pause experience. So the line tool over here can be used. I'll just drag one down, maybe increase the size just a little bit. I can also round out the caps, boop, just like that. And then duplicate. Just hold down Alt or Option and drag over. And if I needed to, I can select both of them and increase the size of the lines. I can space them out a touch. And now I have a pause button. It's not the greatest looking pause button. You might want to reduce that in size, maybe pull this down a little bit, pull them back in a touch. It's it's a pause button. It's not supposed to be super fancy, but it'll work. I'm also going to make sure to group these and just name this pause. Beautiful. Now, over to the right and left, we might also want the back and play button. So for that, I'm going to grab my rectangle. Not my rectangle, my polygon. That's the one I was going to select. I might want to rotate this a touch. There we go. And just like I mentioned before with the rectangles, you've got this little handle on the inside. You can round out the corners a little bit. You can also turn into a star if you wanted to, but maybe we'll get to that at some point. Christoph saying, are these artists getting royalties? Probably not. So I'm going to go ahead. This is actually the forward button. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this over here, turn off the border, grab my line, and just draw one out just like that. Increase the size, round out the caps. You get the idea, right? As you start getting into things, everything will move very quickly. And just pop it right about there. Now the nice thing is, because I now have this element in place, I can very easily group it. This will be called forward. I can duplicate it over to the left with, again, Command Alt or Option held down. And over here within the Properties Inspector, I can very easily flip it horizontally. And now I have my back button. Now we want to make sure that all 3 of these elements are lined up evenly from each other. So there's a few things we can do. We can either just start moving them around, and XD will let us know with these very cool smart padding features that they are now equally aligned. But what we can also do, if they're completely unaligned, right? Something like this, maybe you want this one over here and this one over here, you can select all 3 of them. So again, holding down Shift, clicking on them, you can press your distribution option. So this one right over here is your distribute horizontally. It'll just take all 3 of those elements. It'll look at the one on the far left, the one on the far right, and make sure they're all evenly spaced from each other. And now things are looking pretty fancy. Turn on my guides, make sure everything lines up. Everything is looking pretty good. Beautiful. So now we have our nice music player. Again, I'm just making sure everything's lining up really nicely. Grab my elements here, and my smart guides are helping me throughout that process. All right, now before we move on, I do want to grab all the elements here, make sure they are all placed into a group, which I'm going to call music player. Beautiful. All right, how's that looking? It's looking all right. Let's press Command or Control and then Enter to kind of see how things are looking. It's okay. It's missing a few elements and it could use a few design tweaks, but we might get to those later on. But you may have remembered that down here, we've got all these additional really nice looking albums that we might want to showcase. So how do we do that? Because if we press play and we start scrolling using our mouse or our trackpad, it's not going anywhere. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to select the entire artboard, and you've got these handles around the artboard, and all you have to do is grab the one at the very bottom and drag it downwards, just like this. Now we could leave it right about here, right? But we do have this music player that we're going to fix to the artboard, so we want to leave a little bit extra room for that music player at the bottom, right? But we're also noticing that we've got this pink background, which is kind of pulling in from the artboard's background. So all we have to do in that case is just grab the rectangle, the container, and just whoop, drag it down. So now that we've extended the artboard downwards, you may have noticed that this blue handle appeared over to the left, and that's called the viewport handle, viewport height, whatever you want to call it. And that's essentially letting you know that anything above that handle, which you could drag up or down if you want to adjust it, anything above that handle is going to be visible when you preview this prototype, and anything below it is going to be visible when you start scrolling. So if we take a look, press play one more time, we've got our music player, and again, everything above that handle is visible immediately. And now when we start scrolling, we can see all the information that is below that viewport handle. Now, of course, we're kind of noticing a problem. Our music player is floating in the middle of space. We don't want that. We want to adjust that. And to make that simple, all we have to do is we have everything in a group already, and I would recommend you place it into a group, or like we're going to do shortly, into a component. We have that done, and over here to the right, we've got our fixed position when scrolling option. Boop, there we go. I'm going to press that, and now when we preview one more time, that music player nicely stays fixed into place. And what's really nice is because we have a background blur on that player, everything renders in real time and just looks really fancy, which is really fun. Look at that. Cool stuff. All right, before we wrap up, we have about 10, 13 minutes left, something like that. Let's design out one more artboard so we can kind of look at some very basic prototyping. You know, Monday and Tuesday, when I'm doing my 2-hour streams, we're going to dive much deeper into prototyping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more artboard. I'm going to grab the artboard tool on the left, and I'm going to grab the same artboard. It's going to pop it right there. And for this one, it might give some more information on, let's say, an album that we might click on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my rectangle and draw one out across the entire artboard. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can drag in an image and it doesn't overflow my entire screen. Now let me actually show you what it looks like if I didn't do that. I'm going to go over to Finder. Let's grab this image here and drag it in. And because it's, you know, a fairly large image, it kind of overflows to the left. And if it was a much larger image, for example, if I grab one of the Adobe stock images, whoops, only one, not 5. You're going to notice it's just all over the place, right? So dragging out a rectangle will allow me to essentially create a mask. So if I did want to grab that one image here, pop it into place, everything looks really nice and it just masks it really cool. So now on this screen, we might want to do a few things. We might want to, you know, add a title. We might want to add some buttons and that sort of thing, just to kind of give us more information about this playlist or give us some more control over it. So I'm going to grab my text tool. And this one was called, I think, Up in Smoke. So we're gonna go ahead and type out up in and then maybe smoke, just like that. We might want to make it quite a bit larger. We will center it. Let's go for a nice, I don't know, extra bold possibly. Extra bold doesn't look too bad. Adjust the line spacing. Maybe increase this a little bit more so it's really in our face so we can see it nicely. There we go. And then maybe below, we might want to put the name of the person. In this case, it's Cynthia Willows. That's way too big, so I'm just gonna shrink it down just like that. Maybe I'll drop the weight just a little bit, maybe to semi-bold, and just make sure everything lines up quite nicely. There we go. So now we have that done. We might want a few additional things. We might want a button to maybe add to a playlist. We might want a button to like the design or share it, something like that. So what I'm gonna do is I could go ahead and just do this, maybe move her down a touch. Maybe also center her a little bit. There we go. And then I'm gonna grab my rectangle and simply draw out a button just like this. I can round out the edges to kind of match the rounded aesthetic of everything else. And maybe just so it's not perfectly pure white, maybe I'll just add a background blur. But for this one, I want it a fairly light background blur, just like that. Maybe I'll bring in some of that white. So now it's not, it's not perfectly white, but it's also looking pretty good. It has a little bit of transparency to it. And you can play around with the background blur to get exactly the result you're looking for. And for here, I'm gonna type out add to playlist. And make this a little bit smaller and pop it right about there. Maybe I'll go for a nice bold font because I do want that to be a nice call to action. Now, one thing I do want to point out, you know what, let me darken this a little bit. Just to pull it, just to kind of make sure that there's a nice amount of contrast in there. There we go, that's looking pretty good. All right, so thank you, Eric, I appreciate that. One thing I do want to point out is that we have a fairly new feature called Content-Aware Layout in Adobe XD, and this is perfect for buttons. I love this feature. So we've got this button here, right? I'm going to first turn it into a component, and the way you do that, just like we did before with the border of the stories, is I'm going to hold down Shift, I'm going to click on all the elements that I want inside of this component, and I'm going to press the plus button over here. And just like I did before, I can hop in there, name this button if I wanted to, right? Perfect. So we've got this button inside of our component. And one of the most frustrating things about design, especially if you're working with design systems and buttons and things like that, is you've got this component here. You might want to use a similar component somewhere else. You would go over to your assets, drag out another component. Maybe in this case, it wouldn't say add to playlist. Maybe it would say play song, right? You're noticing that the button is the exact same size, but also if you want, let's say, add song to playlist, right? So we've typed out something else, the button's not really moving anywhere. So what we're gonna do, in that case, we're gonna delete this. With a component or a group selected, you're gonna notice over to the right, a padding option. And when you turn on padding, it's going to enable content-aware layout. It's also going to look at the relationship between the topmost layers and the background layer, which is the layer at the very bottom, and it's going to automatically set padding. So it's letting me know right now there's 14 pixels at the top and the bottom, there's 26 and 27. Of course, I can manually adjust this if I wanted to, just to make sure that everything's really nicely spaced out from each other. But the big advantage of this is if I did need to change the text inside of this button, watch this. Ooh, helps if I can spell properly, but there we go. Or add song to playlist. And like I'm going to show off on Monday and Tuesday, this content-aware layout and padding feature extends much further than buttons. You can add it to entire groups, you can add it to containers, you can add it to pretty much anything, any group or component, and just make your designing so much easier. So I would encourage you all to use padding, add it to your components, add it to your button. And of course, in some cases it may not benefit you, but in situations like this, it absolutely would. So we're running out of time a little bit, so I did want to add a few more elements to this, but I'm going to leave it at this for now. I am also going to add a little bit of a back button. I'm going to turn on my grid, command and control, little apostrophe guy, grab my pen tool, simply draw out a very quick arrow, change the border to white, maybe increase the size a little bit. Beautiful. That's a great looking arrow if I do say so myself. Right? Maybe move this in a little bit. There we go. So the big question is, how do you wire all this up so you can actually start interacting with your prototype? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to switch over to prototype mode right here at the top. And in this case, when a user taps on this particular album, this Up in Smoke one, I want to transition to this artboard over here to the right. So what we're going to do, within prototype mode, we're going to select this particular album, or this card, or whatever you want to call it. We're going to select it, and you're going to see a little handle over here to the right. And this will allow you to pull this handle to the artboard of your choice. And this is called the destination. And once we get into wiring up components, I'll show you how to wire things up within a single artboard, which is really fun. So I've dragged it over to this destination, and it did go ahead and add it over here within the properties inspector, which, by the way, I should probably name these artboards. I'm just going to name this album, and this one I will name home. And that'll make it a lot easier to see kind of what's going on. So we've got our destination as album, and there's a lot of different ways you can transition to, hey, Lena, thanks so much for joining me. See you later, and stay safe. So I'm going to, I dragged it over to the other artboard, and there's a lot of ways you can transition to it. But for now, we're going to stick with simple transitions. And we can choose various animations. So we can either cut, which is none, or dissolve on the basic level, or we can also have it slide or push left, right, up, or down. So maybe, maybe just for a little bit of fun, let's have it slide up. And then we can choose easing options. We'll go for in and out, and a duration. You don't want very quick durations. You also don't want very slow durations. If you go for 1 second, you're going to be making your users wait a long time. You probably don't want to deal with that. So maybe 0.4 seconds should look pretty good. And now if I press play, I've got my preview here. I can scroll down just like we did before. Now I can tap on Up in Smoke, and there comes my new artboard that I just transitioned to, which is really fun, right? Now the question is, how do we get back? Well, there's two things we can do. We could go ahead and grab our lovely little arrow that we created and drag it back to this artboard to create a transition just like we did. However, if this arrow is going to act as a back button, let me undo that. If this arrow is going to act as a back button to go back to whatever artboard it originated from, what we can do is we can simply click on it, click on the blue handle, and then over to the right within the properties inspector, instead of a transition, we can choose previous artboard. And what's cool about this is not only will it take whatever animation was used to get to that artboard and reverse it, but it's also going to take you back to whatever artboard you came from. So if this specific artboard here, this album, is being linked to from 5 different artboards, no matter which artboard you click on this album from, pressing on that back arrow is going to take you back to where you originated from, which is super cool. So let me show you how this works. I'm going to press play one more time. I'm going to scroll down. There's the Up in Smoke album. I'm going to click on that. It's going to take me there. And now I can just press on that. It's going to take me back. And you're going to notice that it reverses the animation. So it went up originally. Now it's going to go down. And I didn't have to do anything else to set that up, which is really fun. Eric is asking, can you share this as a working project on the web? You sure can, Eric. And very quickly to show you that, I'm going to press on share right at the top. And I'm going to dive more into this on Monday and Tuesday. But over here, there's a few different presets. You can share for design review, you can share for development, which many of you were asking about earlier, and I'll dive into that on Monday and Tuesday as well. Presentation, user testing, and all of these do different things. For example, user testing hides hotspot hints. It also hides the navigation bar at the bottom, because essentially what you want your users to do who are testing this is figure it out by themselves. You don't want them to press next, 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 or you don't also want them to give hints, because that kind of defeats the purpose. But for now, I'm going to share for design review. I'm going to name this music player. Again, I got to make sure to spell correctly. There's a lot of different ways to secure your links. You can add passwords. You can share only people. You can allow only people you invited to access it. But I'm just going to go ahead and create the link. It's going to take all those assets, upload them to the cloud, and in a moment, there we go. I have a link right at the top. Right? I can also create a new link if I wanted to, if I wanted one for development, one for user testing, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and press on that. Oh, it popped it on my other monitor. Here we go. And here we go. This is what it looks like, at least for review purposes. And just like I did on my desktop, I can scroll down, I can tap on it. There we go. And all the animations work really nicely. And anyone who's reviewing this can enter a comment over here. They can also drag a pin, let's say right here. add search information. Just like that. They can submit it. I'll get the notification that something has been added. I can make changes, publish that back up to the web, and circle of life continues. So I think that's just about going to do it for today's session. Again, I will be back on Monday and Tuesday, same time, same place, same channel, behance.net/live for 2 hours on Monday and 2 hours on Tuesday. We're going to get a lot deeper. I have a pretty fun project that we're going to be tackling. Kind of fits into the current events. So stick around for that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Jack and Susanna and Eric and Abdullah and Richard and Akin and Daniela and everyone else who has been here over the last hour. Thanks again, everyone. Stay safe. I'm always on Twitter if anyone needs to talk. And I will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.